Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be talking about three wonderful works of historical fiction. So I'm currently reading along with the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction, which is a wonderful prize focusing on historical fiction that I have been reading along with for several years and that I really love. And so today I wanted to review three of the books that are on the Walter Scott Prize long list, two of which I've read in the last month and one of which I read back in December, but I wanted to talk about in a bit more detail because I loved it a lot. So yeah, let's dive into the reviews. I'm going to go in vague order of reverse preference, if that makes sense. So we'll start off with The House of Doors by Tan Truong Eng. So The House of Doors is set in early 20th century Malaysia in Penang, and we're following a couple of different threads in a couple of different timelines. So we start with a kind of prologue and then we flash back to 1920s Penang and what happens when the famous novelist W. Somerset Maugham comes to stay with two friends in Penang, Leslie and Robert. He hasn't seen Robert for many years and he's never met Leslie before, who is Robert's wife. W. Somerset Maugham turns up with his secretary, who Leslie soon realises is also his lover, and Leslie is a bit uncomfortable with this, and in general she isn't really sure how she feels about W. Somerset Maugham, but somehow they get to talking and she ends up telling him the story of not exactly her life, but of a particular point in her life 10 years ago, before the First World War. And then we flash back to 1910 and follow Leslie's life there. And there are kind of two main threads to Leslie's story in the past, one of which is her friendship with a woman called Ethel, who has been accused of murder. And the other thread of her story is how she gets involved kind of in like an administrative capacity with Sun Yat-sen and the kind of Chinese nationalist movement. And we kind of move between Leslie in the 1910s and W. Somerset Maugham and Leslie in the 1920s, and you kind of know from the beginning of the book that W. Somerset Maugham is going to use something that Leslie tells him about her life to write a story. So there were a lot of things that I enjoyed and found really interesting in The House of Doors. I found the way it kind of intersected with history really interesting, and especially the kind of like mix of fact and fiction, and the kind of way that Leslie's life intersects with these big real historical people and these big real historical events. You know, her friendship with W. Somerset Maugham and Sun Yat-sen, and kind of the way her life is intersected with sort of British literary history and Chinese political history, but also the history of Malaysia. Like, I thought that stuff was really interesting. And you know, whenever I read books that are on the long list for the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction, I'm not just thinking about them as books that happen to be set in the past. I'm thinking about the way that they interact with history, because that's something I find really interesting in historical fiction. The other thing that I found really interesting in The House of Doors is the kind of like W. Somerset Maugham angle in it and how it has been inspired by W. Somerset Maugham. I will say that I had never read any W. Somerset Maugham before reading this book. Since reading The House of Doors, I went and read the short story that inspired The House of Doors, and that the story of The House of Doors is meant to have inspired within the fictional world of the novel, because I thought that might be interesting. And it was really interesting, especially because I feel like it's a very interesting way of working backwards. It's very hard to explain what I mean unless you have read both, but if you read The Letter by W. Somerset Maugham and then The House of Doors by Tan Truong Eng, or the other way round, then you will see how Tan Truong Eng has kind of taken elements from The House of Doors and like split them out into lots of different things, so that as a reader reading The House of Doors and reading The Letter, you can imagine how W. Somerset Maugham might have taken lots of different elements from lots of different bits of Leslie's life and Leslie's stories and turned them into The Letter. So for example, there is a character called Leslie in The Letter, but it's very clear in The House of Doors that the character who becomes Leslie in The Letter is actually Leslie's friend, not Leslie. I'm not really sure that makes much sense, but I do feel like there were some interesting things done there with like looking at literature and inspiration, I guess. However, I feel like there were probably a lot of other elements of the House of Doors that I would have got more out of if I had read more W. Somerset Maugham, or if I'd read any W. Somerset Maugham before reading the House of Doors. So for example, Leslie and W. Somerset Maugham talk quite a lot in the book about the fact that Somerset Maugham always writes about affairs, and there's quite a lot in this book about affairs and fidelity. And I feel like if I had read a lot of W. Somerset Maugham, then there were probably a lot of other references and themes that I would have got a little bit more out of in the House of Doors. In general, the House of Doors was a very interesting novel with a lot of interesting themes and a lot of interesting elements and threads, and the characters were very interesting. I think especially because neither W. Somerset Maugham, as he's presented in this book, or Leslie are especially likeable characters. Like, they both have quite dislikable things about them, but I feel like the dislikable things about them were explored in a really interesting way that made you understand and sympathise with both. And I also feel like this book looks very interestingly at kind of themes of colonialism in the early 20th century. I think especially for a character like Leslie, who is sort of white British living in Penang, but has lived her whole life in Penang. And we know from the beginning of the book that her husband Robert has been advised to move elsewhere for his health, and Leslie is very, very unwilling to leave Penang because she views this place entirely as her home. And there's also a lot in this novel about the Straits Chinese community in Penang. So people who were descendants of Chinese immigrants to Malaysia, who also have this kind of dual national identity of both China and Malaysia. And then we have W. Somerset Maugham, who really loves to travel, who never wants to stay in London, who wants to move between lots of different places. And so the way this book looks at place and identity and belonging is really, really interesting. And I feel like the way that kind of interacts with early 20th century colonialism and the kind of exploration of that is within the book, I found all that stuff really, really interesting. So as you might be able to tell from everything I've just said, there's quite a lot going on within the House of Doors. And I think the one thing that I slightly struggled with in it was like finding what the centre of the book was. And I think that is partly because it is slightly too literary for my taste, and as a slightly less literary reader, I sort of prefer a main central plot with threads coming off it, rather than like a lot of threads weaving together in a tapestry and you have to kind of like work out which to focus on. And I feel like that is the point of the book, and I kind of like that the title, The House of Doors, does refer to a real place, the House of Doors, which you don't encounter until more than halfway through the novel. But I also feel like the book itself is very much like a House of Doors. Like, there's lots of different threads you could follow, there's lots of different doors you could go through to look at like different things and different themes and different characters. And in a way I feel like that was very effective and did work well and kind of tied in with the title and with the themes of the book as a whole. But also sometimes I kind of didn't know what door to go through, like I didn't know what thread to follow or what to be focusing on. And I think that's a very personal reading taste thing. Overall I did really enjoy it, and I did think it was a really interesting read. Let me move on to the next book I want to review in this video, and that is The New Life by Tom Crew. This one I read back in December, and it was one of my favourite books of 2023. I loved it a lot, and I was so delighted to see it on the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction longlist. So I have already spoken about this book in a few other videos, but I thought I would talk about it a bit more today because I want to give a bit more time to it now that it's on the Walter Scott Prize longlist, and kind of to place it in context with other books on the Walter Scott Prize longlist. So this book is set in the late Victorian period in the 1890s, and we're following two men who end up coming together to write a book on homosexuality, which in the late 19th century was still illegal, was still very, very taboo. These two men are John Addington and Henry Ellis. So John Addington, we know from the beginning of the book, is married, he has 3 children, but he is gay, he is always known he's attracted to men, and his wife is kind of aware of it and not happy with it, but kind of is stuck in their marriage. And at the beginning of the book, he meets a young man called Frank, who he falls in love with, and this is one of the things that kind of prompts him to want to write this book. And then the other man that John ends up writing this book with is Henry Ellis. And at the very beginning of the book, Henry Ellis gets married to a woman called Edith. She's a writer and freethinker herself. They are both part of what they call the New Life movement, and Edith is very much kind of a new woman figure. Edith and Henry have got married, but they are intending to still live independent lives. They're not going to live together. They're going to share their lives in a way that suits them. But very early on in their marriage, Edith meets a woman called Angelica, and Henry begins to wonder if the marriage that he and Edith have agreed to is exactly what he thought he was agreeing to. And Henry and John kind of exchange letters and get to know each other kind of through each other's academic work, and they decide to come together to write a book called Sexual Inversion, which is about homosexuality in men. And they interview lots of men to get their experiences, and they kind of write this book, which is meant to explore what it means to be gay in the late 19th century, but also to kind of put forward a case for why it shouldn't be illegal. And the book looks really fascinatingly at the lives of these two men, and also how deciding to write this very radical, taboo book changes both of their lives, and also what they are willing to sacrifice for their principles. There was so much that I loved about The New Life as a book. I thought the characterization was fantastic, and John and Henry are both very, very complicated characters who at times are dislikable, but also you really sympathize with. And I think one of the things this book looked at fantastically was kind of the battle between wanting to improve the world and having strong principles and needing to protect yourself and to protect your family and your loved ones. And I feel like this book tackled that complicated dynamic so well and in a really believable way, where you kind of both sympathized with and felt sorry for everyone, but you also kind of disapproved of certain people's actions. I feel like that was done really, really well. I also feel like this book captured the 1890s perfectly and captured the very complicated, contradictory viewpoints that were in existence in the 1890s. Over the last year, I've been reading quite a lot of novels from the 1890s and a lot of new women novels, which kind of push the boundaries of social norms in the late Victorian period. And I feel like The New Life really captured the 1890s so well as this time where there was this great feeling of a change. You know, the 1890s were a time where it really felt like there was a lot more social freedom and like more was coming, but also there was a backlash against this. And this book looks really interestingly at that, both in terms of gender and sexuality. And this book kind of takes place in the run-up to the Oscar Wilde trial, which is really interesting too. As I said earlier, when I think about books that are on the Walter Scott Prize long list, I always like to think about how these books interact with the past. And I feel like one of my favourite things about The New Life was how it really captured the 1890s in a really fantastic, complicated way. And I think that was especially important and especially interesting in The New Life because I feel like a lot of people have in their heads a very set idea of the Victorian period, which is actually like the 1850s, whereas the 1890s was a very different time. And I feel like Tom Crewe in The New Life really conjured up the world I recognise from like George Gissing and other later Victorian writers, but obviously exploring themes that were, not really touched on very much on the surface, at least, in Victorian literature. And I also feel like I got even more out of The New Life having read it when I did, because I had been reading a lot of new women novels from the 1890s and was kind of already really interested in and thinking a lot about kind of social movements in the late 19th century. It is quite interesting to think about how this book interacts with real history, because obviously, as I said, the Oscar Wilde trial, which is a very, well-known historical event, is very important in this book, but also there are a lot of other elements of this book that do come from a real historical fact. So I didn't actually realise while I was reading this novel until I got to the author's note that there was a book published in the 1890s called Sexual Inversion that was written by Havelock Ellis and John Addington Symonds. So, quite similar names to the fictional characters in this book. I think this novel is fairly loosely inspired by the real historical events. And one thing I found quite interesting was when I was looking at the kind of Goodreads reviews for The New Life, a lot of the less positive reviews I found were from people who had known a lot about the real historical figures that this is based on and kind of struggled with how much this book departed from the real historical fact. Personally, that didn't bother me at all, but I suppose that is something that is kind of interesting to think about when thinking about this as a work of historical fiction that interacts with history. There was just so much that I loved about this book. I thought it was fantastically written, and the characterization, the complexities of the characterization and the kind of themes it explored were just wonderful. I really, really loved this book so much. I found it really moving and really powerful. I read it kind of in a day or two over the Christmas period, and I just thought it was fantastic. I highly, highly recommend The New Life, and I was delighted to see it on the long list. And also, I read it 3 months ago, and I still have a lot to say about it, and it's still very fresh in my mind, which is kind of nice as well. Definitely one that will stand the test of time, and yeah, what a great book. I feel like, having said I was doing these in my reverse order of preference and having spoken about The New Life in the middle, you can tell that I loved Cuddy a lot. So next, I want to talk about Cuddy by Benjamin Myers, which was just like an utter delight in every way. This book was incredible. To be honest, I feel like I probably love Cuddy and The New Life an equal amount, but I feel like Cuddy is such an innovative book in the way that it looks at history that I want this to win the Walter Scott Prize. I say that having read 5.5 books that are on the long list, even when I have read the whole long list, I don't think I'm going to read anything that I'm going to want to win more than Cuddy, because this book, okay, right, I have many thoughts, let's go. This is Cuddy by Benjamin Myers, and this book was amazing. So how do I even describe what this book is? It is quite wild in many ways, but it is amazing. My library copy is very shiny and keeps reflecting everything, so I'm going to put this down and put a picture up on the screen instead before I reflect all of the light in the room. So, Cuddy by Benjamin Myers is a really wonderful, innovative, experimental work of historical fiction. As a novel, it is focused on the legacy of St Cuthbert, who was a monk and a bishop who existed in the Anglo-Saxon times. And this book is split into a few different parts, which take place at different points throughout history and look at the legacy of St Cuthbert, or Cuddy. So book one takes place in the Anglo-Saxon period, in the time following St Cuthbert's death, and we follow a group of monks who are moving around England looking for a place where they can put St Cuthbert's remains, and kind of found a church to house his remains. And this church will go on to be Durham Cathedral. And in this book one, we're following a young girl who is travelling with these monks who has visions. And book one is told in a unique style where the bits from the perspective of the young girl are kind of a blend of poetry and prose. And then in between these sections, we have these chapters which are made up of secondary and primary sources, where you kind of get a chapter, but every single sentence is a quote from another source. So you kind of see how St Cuthbert is portrayed in all of these different sources. So you get this picture of St Cuthbert's life and legacy through all of these different opinions about him throughout history, which was just like so wild and awesome. Then we move on to book two, and book two is written mostly in kind of regular prose, and we're following a woman in 1346 who is living in Durham, who is in an abusive marriage. And then we have a section told in play script form set in 1650, and then we have a section told in diary form from 1827, and then we have a section told in kind of regular prose set in 2019. And all of these sections kind of take place in Durham and follow different characters at different points of time who in some way are kind of interacting with St Cuthbert. And there's also a little bit of a, not exactly like a reincarnation thread running through it, but sort of, if anyone's read Cloud Atlas, there's sort of like a Cloud Atlas feel of maybe a character turning up in one narrative who has something in common with a character in a previous narrative. And as a book, it is slightly wild. It is very much more experimental than the stuff I usually read. And the blending of different forms and like the mixed media was really experimental, but really fantastic. And it works so well for me because, you know, that is what history is. History is piecing together lots of different fragments from lots of different sources, most of which are biased, and you gather together all of these sources and you piece them together into something that resembles a story, and that's what history is. And that was why I loved Cuddy so much, because this book was a book about history and how we tell stories about history and about how we make sense of history. And I just thought that was amazing. Like the structure of this and the experimentation behind the way this book worked was amazing. I have read a couple of books that do similar things before, thinking especially of Overton by Adam Thorpe and News of the Dead by James Robertson, both of which I really liked. I especially loved News of the Dead, which won the Walter Scott Prize a few years ago, and I feel like I went into Cuddy really hoping that I would love it as much as News of the Dead, and I did, and I just thought it was amazing. And I think all three of those books really interestingly use a mix of formats and a kind of range of different time periods to really look at history as a thing, and like the concept of history, and also to look at the specific history of a specific place and how places use history to create a sense of identity. So I feel like if you have read any of those three books and not the others, then you would like them all. Like they all, for me, have a lot in common. Do I love Cuddy even more than I love News from the Dead? I don't know. I did also find Cuddy an exceptionally emotional book. Like, there were a lot of bits in it that were really powerful, and especially the last section, the section set in 2019, was very emotive and very powerful. And I was like completely in floods of tears for like the last 20 pages of this book. And I feel like the fact that this book managed to be so experimental and so unique and so strange in its form, and to explore the concept of history so well, while also having these really rich, fully formed characters that you felt really emotionally invested in, or that you felt really interested in even when you didn't like them. The one in the 19th century, I did not like him, but I still found his story really interesting. And I found myself so emotionally invested with the rest of these characters in a really interesting way that just meant this book was really, really powerful. I will say that I do feel like I loved Cuddy, especially because it is set in Durham, and I studied at Durham, that's where I went to university, so you know, I lived there for 3 years, and you know, I studied history and English literature at Durham. I've also been to Lindisfarne, which is where St Cuthbert lived for a lot of his life, and so I feel like there were a lot of specific personal things that meant I went into this book knowing a bit about St Cuthbert already and knowing a lot about Durham, which did mean this book was even more impactful for me and even more emotional. You know, there were all these bits when they're in the cathedral or on Palace Green, and I used to like go to those places like nearly every day when I lived in Durham. Like, you know, I had lectures on Palace Green and stuff. You know, there's a bit in the 1346 section where two characters go up the tower of Durham Cathedral. And like, I think the tower of Durham Cathedral was fairly extensively rebuilt in the 15th century. So how much of that tower is the same tower that I went to the top of when I was a student, I don't know. But like, you know, imagining these characters at the top of Durham Cathedral Tower in the 14th century when I've been up that tower was like really surreal and really lovely. There's like a tradition at Durham University where you don't go up the tower of the cathedral. It's either until you've graduated or it's until your last exam, but like there's a superstition that you're not meant to go up the cathedral tower until you're done with your degree. And I have like such a vivid memory of going up to the top of Durham Cathedral Tower in 3rd year. So yeah, I do feel like my love for Cuddy as a book was very much heightened by the fact that I went to Durham and have like a real emotional connection to Durham as a place and to Durham Cathedral as a place. But, you know, completely regardless of that fact, I think this is an incredible novel that is exceptionally powerful, exceptionally well written, really, really experimental, and explores both lots of different time periods and the context of lots of different time periods and the concept of history in such an amazing way. And I really, really want this to win the Walter Scott Prize. I just thought this was amazing, and I feel like this is such an innovative, interesting book that it really deserves to win a prize about historical fiction, because it is both an amazing novel as a novel, but also it's an amazing book about history as a book about history, and I just thought it was amazing. So yeah. What a great book, what a great book. I do love The New Life a lot too, and The House of Doors is really good, but Cuddy has definitely stolen the show. This is one of my favourite books of the year so far, and yeah, I thought it was amazing. I feel like this has been a slightly longer video than I intended, but I had a lot to say about these wonderful books, and also I feel like I don't do like individual reviews or, you know, videos talking about just a few books very often, and I feel like I have a lot to say, so yeah, I hope that you enjoyed this video, and let me know if you want kind of more review length stuff from me. Do let me know as well down in the comments if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them. And otherwise, that's all for now. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.